Good evening. My name is Nicholas Bohm, Director and Chief Curator of Public Art Fund, and it's a delight to welcome you on what actually does feel like a wintry night, finally. I don't know whether Roger has brought the European cool, but we're very glad he's here. First of all, great thanks to Karen Quoney, who's Director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, her colleagues, Pam Tillis, Annie Shaw, here at the New School. It's always wonderful to collaborate with them on this series, which now goes back many years. We do, of course, our spring and fall seasons, and this is the first in our spring season, even though perhaps it doesn't feel quite as spring-like today as it has recently. We're grateful, of course, to the many individuals who contribute to Public Art Fund and help make this possible. We, in this sort of talk series, we aim to showcase some of the most dynamic and inventive artists working in the public realm. These artists reveal ways in which public art challenges expectations and takes on new forms as it engages with the public realm. Our second talk, if I can just give a kind of promo for the next, which takes place on March 28th, will present the distinguished American artist Fred Wilson. I think this will be an incredibly timely discussion addressing the relationship between civic politics and public art. As you may know, Fred Wilson's piece, E Pluribus Unum, commissioned for the Cultural Trail in Indianapolis, was recently cancelled following community opposition to Wilson's appropriation of the figure of a slave within the work. So I think that'll be a really important and interesting discussion. Tonight, we're here to welcome and to listen to Roger Hiorns, the Turner Prize-nominated British artist. Roger is an artist whose work really exemplifies ways in which art can challenge our expectations of objects and art in public space. He's used materials as diverse as jet engines, bovine parts, nitrates, and salt, to broadly investigate the possibility of transformation in objects, social encounters, and urban situations. Roger is well known for his 2009 Art Angel commission, Seizure, in which he pumped 75,000 litres of copper sulfate solution into an abandoned South London council flat to create a sort of extraordinary crystalline growth on the walls, floor, and ceiling. It was really quite transformative, literally and metaphorically. More recently, he presented a large-scale installation at MoMA Pierce 1 as part of Peter Ely's wonderful exhibition September 11th, in which he reduced a jet engine to dust. Roger lives and works in London. He's had solo exhibitions at the Aspen Art Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, Tate Britain, Camden Arts Centre, and the UCLA Hammer Museum. Tonight, Roger will focus his talk on a series of recent proposals, or one might even say scores, that expand upon the possibilities of sculptural practice as performance, intervention, and transformation. I'm really looking forward to Roger's presentation tonight. He did actually confide earlier that at a recent lecture he presented in England, some people actually walked out in response to his showing a work featuring a naked man. I assured him, however, that this would not come as a shock in Greenwich Village. Please join me in welcoming Roger Hiorns.
Well, thanks for coming. Okay. Well, what I should do first is I should suggest that to keep some sense of informality, it would be interesting for people to chip in should they want to. So I'm going to open the floor up right from the beginning. And I think it's interesting just to allow other people to maybe change the course of the conversation and maybe ambush me would be quite useful. And so that's usually the form that I usually take with lectures back home. So it can be quite useful. I think the way that I'll begin is I proposed a group of texts for the most benign piece of description that I could give them to Nicholas. It'd been a group of ideas, been a group of pieces which I'd been working with for a long, long time. And they were offering for me a sense of escape from the studio. I've been working in the studio quite a lot, and it's quite nice, or it's important to suddenly disconnect, to almost purge that environment, to almost feel slightly guilty that you've been producing. That's quite a loaded phrase, probably a bit too early on, but I think that it was important for me to actually produce and then stop. And I think it's important to continue to reassess. And so these pieces of text were very useful in terms of little objects or little scenarios which could be then pointed at or used in a certain context. And I think that when I put the text together, which I think is called Skylines, it was important to suggest that they were for New York. It was to suggest that the context of New York could potentially be changed, that you could tamper, perhaps. And so I'll probably talk about this one over my shoulder a little bit more. But what I probably will do later. But first of all, what I'll go into is the origin of where some of the text came from. I wrote a piece of, I guess for a better expression, a play about 4 or 5 years ago called Benign. And the play itself was a description of a very long-winded ritualistic behavior towards a youth. Bad timing. So what was happening to this youth within this text? And so the text itself was played out. It was played out by this guy describing it as a monologue, sitting there. And this was in the Serpentine Pavilion when Wren Coolhouse did it. And so it was commissioned as a West End preview, or West End debut, of this rather sort of obscure little thing. And so I put it together, and I had this guy called Heathcote, and he used to be in Derek Jarman films, and he's quite a character, and he had his back to the audience, and he delivered this text, and the text itself, as I say, was the conglomeration of a number of ritualistic behaviors, which were difficult. And so the next image is the development of Benign, which was then into a film. The film itself was very plain. It was just this text being read out. And it was read out by someone with a very English voice. And then the imagery that was happening over the top of it was these gestures, these kind of sexualized hand gestures which had been slowed down. And so what was happening in front of you was this rather intense piece of text being delivered to you directly to the center of your head. I wanted the vibration of the voice to almost coincide with the vibration which would be reasonably uncomfortable, a certain timbre of the voice. Delivering this rather sort of strange artificial landscape which I was describing. And so the sexualized gestures were piling on some kind of pressure, piling on some kind of aggression into the environment. And so the film itself developed into a number of gestures. This is another one. And these gestures manifest themselves in a group of figurative works that I later came to, which I'll show you in a bit. That one, I think, looks like a head. Okay, so the next text, the next proposition that came with these groups of text that I proposed to Nicholas. This was a proposal that was in this text, this body of text called Benign. It was describing a number of scenarios within this text. And so this one was to mechanically grind and render into fine dust and shard the engines from a passenger jet aircraft, powder the town square, or a place of focus with the dust. The mass's circumstances are always open. Now, this was a piece that eventually ended up at PS1 recently. And so this was the engine, the jet engine, which was pulverized. And so the work itself, for me, was an open gesture. It was open to the idea that you were making a piece of work which had formlessness at its key. It was a piece of work which didn't attract any sense of itself, maybe denied its own sense of its own identity, perhaps. And for me, that was a key factor in making an object. And so I took a jet engine, and I pulverized it. I had it sent to South Africa, which was then atomized, and then the powder was sent back to me. So it was a process of remoteness and disinterest, which was kind of part of the making of the work. I was very interested. The work itself was made with the sense of the disinterest of industrial process. So even the work itself was alien to me, completely objectified. So it was simply an idea that I'd written down in a text, in a play, which was played out in Serpentine Pavilion a number of years ago, then becoming an object that was present in the world. And so there was a number of these things. There's a number of these ideas. And so the next image, this is the original display of the piece, which was at Corvey Moore Gallery in London. It will always be different. It will always have someone else's hand. It will always be someone else delivering the piece, putting it on the ground. The piece itself was also I was quite keen that I would never, ever be involved in its display because I didn't want to be present in the piece itself. I didn't want my own gesture to be present. And so it was very important to suggest that the work itself was completely temporary or completely formless by the fact that other people were going to do it. I suggested that the piece could also stand on a stage during a stage play, perhaps, or it could be constantly on an aeroplane flying across the world. It could be anywhere. It's a piece of work which gives you permission to treat it in a way which is not necessarily the way that you would treat an art object in any other sense. In a way, I want to offer the sense of the ideal is to offer you a sense of permission in order to proceed with the idea of how to behave with artworks, perhaps. And it's I don't know, I'm overstating it perhaps a little bit at this point, but it's a very important factor or a very important key is to suggest how it is that we're supposed to behave in the world at this point. And so for me at this point in time, the way that I wanted to behave was to take a dominant object, a jet engine, and to render it into nothing, into powder. There's a close-up. This is at the Turner Prize. That was fun. And this is the work being put away. Okay, so the next group of works. A single street within the city industrially disinfected over and over, cleansed by a social or economic group, perhaps a corporate institution. Both activities occur on a tight schedule. This was something which is key within the work quite early on, which was the idea of ritualistic behavior, about the fact that you could become obsessive-compulsive about objects. I come from a quite a secular point of view, so I'm very interested in the obsessive-compulsive disorder that we pronounce towards the world every day through our activities, and how we can become locked in to certain forms and regimes of behavior, perhaps. And so, so in order to break those regimes, it's kind of important or interesting to, one, acknowledge them, and then to, two, offer a certain set of daily choreography that you can actually then separate. It allows you to separate yourself from the day-to-day. And so I used to live on a street in London called Fleet Street. And Fleet Street's very famous. It's reasonably famous for being the home of gutter press, the idea that the press, a certain type of press, were always going to be present in this street. And so it was a hive of activity, always very dirty, always a lot of people smoking. And it was always very interesting. And I lived above a pub on Fleet Street. And so what used to happen after Fleet Street and all the newspapers had moved out was some rather large corporations moved in. The street itself then became disinfected every day. It used to be that the regime in the City of London, which is a very unusual environment in itself, it's a square mile which is separated from the rest of London, has its own rules. But they have a tendency to overdo it when it comes to the hygiene of their streets. So they had a tendency to just spray a lot of disinfectant around. And so this was a kind of a motif. This was something that I paid attention to and found very interesting, this over-obsessiveness. The fountain and the monument within the city, disinfected and cleansed over and over. Cleaned by the social institution, perhaps the religious. Fountain and the monument within the city. So yes, it's the cleaning of the monument. I'll talk about some more than others. Some of them are actually quite dull. Okay, so this is a piece of work which is actually sort of in its form quite early on. It's not even hanging on the wall. It's the basin that I grew up with when I was a kid, and a piece of text which was misdelivered to my studio. This motif, this idea that the religious text, perhaps, appears quite a number of times within the work, within my work. The idea of the prayer, for instance, will occur later on in the lecture. And what it struck me with this particular piece was that I wanted a receptacle for this misdelivered piece of text. So basically I had a church move into the studio next door to me. It was an ad hoc, kind of very sort of basic sort of African church, which happens quite a lot in the region that I live. Basically everything that used to be industrial, the buildings that used to have production happen within them, all were turned over or sold on to the myriad of churches. And so what I would find is that I would have these religious sort of notes come through my studio door. It would be from the next door. I would hear their services, for instance, when I was making work. And so there was a certain sort of clash. There was a certain sort of continuous clash that if my radio wasn't working, which it rarely does, is that I would be making work to a religious score or to a slightly evangelical nature. And so this seeped into a group of works which was interesting. A group of works which I was working on. And then it became a very physical boundary. This piece of text was supposed to go to the church next door. The church had closed down by this point. And so this text is a text in French, which is basically a text about how you're supposed to run a church, how you're supposed to behave in a church, how you're supposed to be a pastor to a ad hoc, really sort of basic church that you're supposed to deliver to a small flock, to a small group of people. And so this rather strange text basically goes through that possibility. And I wanted to put it in this container, which is the sink. I'm still working on this piece, so I shouldn't probably brought this one out, but Theranos Bible College is the name. It's entirely possible to insert a passenger 747 just under the skin of the land, that the aircraft can be buried quite shallow or quite deep, but buried in its entirety, and through discrete access can be accessed internally. Okay. Yes, I was interested in this idea. But I think that that's probably enough on that point, I think, to talk about this. I think it's quite direct. Only to mention that I was very interested in a certain type of behavior when I'd made this piece of work called Seizure. Seizure was basically, as Nicholas described, the flooding of 75,000 litres of chemical into a council house. And that council house then became internally crystallized. And so through this crystallization, the house obviously was rendered into something else. And so what happened during the period of this is that visitors, and it got a lot of visitors, had certain behaviors, repeat patterns, people would come and come. But also you would have the thing that you would see if you went to a Long Barrow or a historical site, rather like not so much Stonehenge, but the underground sites, is that people would then use the site as a spiritual destination. You would actually find people within the environment meditating, perhaps. This was probably far more New Age than anything else. And for me, this was interesting. This was interesting that I'd made a very synthetic environment, an environment which didn't exist, and built from a social structure, a construction of social structures, and I'd grown this object inside it. For people then to take this synthetic object and actually use it for a spiritual destination seemed to be actually incredibly interesting because it was a synthetic environment that they were coming into. And so, yeah, so I wanted to take that a little further. And so the idea that you could actually sort of access a certain level of anxiety, that you could actually bring anxiety further, would be to take the object of complete anxiety, which is, for me personally, a dominant object like a jet plane, and actually render it useless, put it under the ground. And it could be then the cave. It could be the long barrow of the future, perhaps. And so that people's behavior might also be the same as you would be on an airplane, that it would be a slightly meditative, long-winded relationship to the underground rather than the overground. Okay, so the proposal to the people of Tuckerton, New Jersey. Okay, so I'm going to go through these, but factually, this is all from Wikipedia and also some bits and bits of investigation on internets. So in a way, the completeness of these texts is under question. And to some degree, that's something I enjoy and kind of encouraging. It's possible for a prayer group to be assigned to direct prayer towards Stage 2 Construction, Inc., TAT 14 Cable Landing Station, 14 Cable Drive, Tuckerton, New Jersey. Prayers applied from a distant remove simply to apply prayers towards and into the central object of global communication. This is basically a prayer group which I had next door to me at the time. And that they would take donations. If you gave them donations, they would pray for something. They would pay for you, and they would pay for something. And so it was perfectly acceptable and possible for them to pray for this object, for this building. And so this building itself is basically the hub, where the internet actually accesses itself into the whole of America, of North America. So it's an important building. It's a very strange building if you look on it. If you take this address, look on it on Google Maps, for instance, it's a very strange little thing that you see. And so, yes, it's possible to open up a transaction of language, of meditative language, towards an object of complete global communication. And so, in a way, I wanted to perhaps clash two forms of communication. One rather archaic and one, but still useful, and the other one contemporary. And to see that fold into each other in some kind of confusing and problematic way. And so, yes, on an afternoon, probably in a wet Wednesday in London, this was acted out for about a couple of hours. And in the same note, this was the other one. Also as well, which was interesting, is that I was very keen that the London Review of Books published these as poems. And they kindly said no. It is possible for a prayer group to be assigned to direct prayer towards the Western Union building at 60 Hudson Street, in remove or as part of a hands-on corporate team, to apply their prayers towards and into the central object of world communications. And so in a way it's a similar nature. I have no idea if 60 Hudson Street is the same building as it was when I looked into it, which was basically a cable and wireless interchange for the internet, for the North America again, or for the whole of New York. But I'm assuming that that is. This is an object which then formed from that. This is an object which formed from, or a group of objects formed from the prayer group work, which was that, yes, this prayer group had been entertained by the idea that they could objectify their prayers, that the objects themselves were going to become imbued with a certain activity, with a certain sort of ritualistic activity, objectified somehow. And so I wanted to take that a little further. I wanted to make a group of objects, one of which was prayed for, one of which was called, the work itself was called Untitled, but Untitled John. And so John was prayed for. And so this is the object, John, within a number of objects. And so in a way, I wanted to open up this rather immaterial channel, but still, within our own sort of existence, a logical channel, to some degree, of devotional responsibility to a work. And so, yeah, I found it interesting, perhaps. Also, as well, is that I'll go back to the idea of permission. I gave myself permission to allow myself to make these pieces of work. To some degree, some might say is not exploitative, but problematic. Because I come from not a religious background, but I come from a background where religion was present. And so I found myself in certain situations possibly being prayed for, almost certainly at one occasion, even though that's not something that I was particularly needing or particularly welcoming in any sense. I'm very secular. And so it was interesting for me to find that repeat, that something that might happen to me, that something that I was under, this regime that I was under could actually happen to an object too. That the work itself then became completely formless, that the work itself didn't conclude itself in any sense in the present. If you saw the piece of work here, it wouldn't be fully here. It would be present within the communication happening perhaps in a prayer group in Rotherhithe or for any other matter anywhere else. So the work itself is present but not. And in a certain sense, it certainly reflects a certain attitude. And so, yes, I gave myself permission to work with prayer groups simply because I'd been under this regime myself, and I think I can speak for it and feel confident that I'm not being exploitative in any sense. This is the group. This is the church. This is the next-door neighbours. And as you can see, it's a number of different churches in one building. Well, I don't know if you can see that, but this is me working in the studio. It's rather sweet. And yes, the noise next door. It's an object called John. Oh, sorry, this one's called Paul, sorry. And Paul is being prayed for. And Paul is an object, an engine from a Mercedes. And so in a way I wanted to present the object of the engine. I present the object of the engine quite often in some of the works. It's a dominant object, and for me it's an interesting object to try and insult. It's a starting point. And I think that if you're insulting objects, it's some way of kind of breaking them down, breaking down the regime that they bring with them. And so you can take apart an object and you can perhaps rebuild it in a certain other way. This is the church next door again. Okay, flick through these. Okay, the introduction of working shower cubicles around Central Park, set within the denser parts of the park shadow, the shower supply installed and paid up by corporate institutions. Kind of speaks for itself. Going back to the ritualistic, these are objects which I was very interested in imbuing the sense of ritual within the person who was supposed to look after the work, that you had a certain responsibility to an object, that the object wasn't going to simply be a formalist exercise in being dumb to some degree, that it wasn't passive in any sense, that you were supposed to have some responsibility to an object. So these objects were made. They share a sort of formalist language, but that language is not something I buy into particularly. And they're disinfected. They're disinfected by people daily. So those discs on the surface are scattered with disinfectant. And so someone would do this every day. And you can see the staining. This is a bench piece, slightly out of sync, so we'll go back to that one. This is a piece which is perfumed, where the crotch would be. It's a very basic form, head and shoulder, and a body. And then the piece is sprayed with, I think this one was Jean Patou. This is a sheet of silver, which is poured on amyl nitrate. This is a piece which is outside Jesus College. Jesus College is a part of an Oxbridge college. These places don't change. They'll always be the same. They'll be preserved for as long as they'll live. As long as we're on this planet, I can imagine. They've been there for a long time, and they will continue to be a long time. So I thought it was a very interesting place to insert a piece of work, to insert a project that would then take on that possibility of lasting a long, long time. And so, yes, this is a sheet of silver which is outside the church door, and it's leaned on. It was put in a place where people, the youths of Jesus College, would lean on the wall before they went to church, because that door is always closed and it needs to be opened. And so I found it as a place that certain behavior was happening. So I thought it would be interesting to insert an object, to put a sheet of silver and to ritualize, or to draw attention to that ritualistic behavior. And so this is a sheet of silver with the patina of use. And this new ritual within a building which is completely soaking with ritual, was inserted. This is one of the rooms from Seizure. And there was a sort of, actually I'll go back to that, there was a certain obsessive compulsiveness about the building Seizure. There was a certain problematic to the building, which was that it was used for people who had, it wasn't intentional, but it was for people who had social issues, that they couldn't divide their time with the world as successfully as others. And so the building itself became rather dysfunctional. And so I'll show you the structure of Seizure in a little while. So these are other sort of rather ritualistic kind of behaviors in terms of artworks. So I'll just flick through these. These are foam works. And this is a Merce Cunningham performance. Well, this is the rehearsal for a Merce Cunningham performance. And so these works were a reflection of what was happening. The foam works is a very early work. Basically, it's a reduction. It was something that I was very interested in producing, which was to make a group of works, each one an individual, each one simply exuding substance. It's just an object that hangs in space, exuding substance. And if I was being particularly mean, it would be a reflection of me and perhaps most of us, just objects in space exuding substance. You know, that's pretty much a reduction of what it is. And so in a way, I wanted to make an object of that. I wanted to sort of draw attention to that possibility that, that you could turn the us into a reductive form somehow. And so the forms are made by hand, and the foam is unstoppable. And it moves. This is a rather large version in nature at the Calder Foundation. So this is Calder's old studio. I spent a residency there. And I found it very difficult to kind of comprehend, but also to deal with the idea of the weight of the building, the weight of how Calder had sort of inhabited and built these objects in this massive warehouse space in the middle of France. And it was about how you're supposed to sort of weigh in with your own work, perhaps, how you're supposed to behave with all of this kind of weighty sort of modernism kind of sitting on your shoulders. His tools were still there. It's kind of interesting. And you were, you know, encouraged to perhaps use some of them. His boiler didn't work, so it was always cold. And so in a way, my response was to put in the landscape this vast tub, which we'd found in a kind of reclamation yard, and just basically just exuded foam into the landscape and just atomized into the landscape, rather in this rather 60s way. This is an early piece. Another early piece at the Tate. This is a fire which was inserted into the courtyard outside the Tate. And it was just a simple suggestion that there's something wrong. There's a problem underneath the ground. A boys' church choir, wearing their uniforms or home clothes, are lying on the ground, loosely dispersed, separated, arranged individuals, playfully dead, and singing together new and old songs. Okay, so this is a piece which the next slide will... Actually, I'll just play the next slide. So this was commissioned to be produced as a one-off. We should get there. Okay. So it's important to propose. I think that what I've been perhaps doing up to this point has been proposing. I think that it's important to suggest that, it's possible to make artworks that act like prototypes, that can actually perhaps suggest certain ways of making, certain ways of behaving. And I guess I'm quite aware also that I've showed you a lot of different working methods, a lot of different ways of acting, I guess, as an artist. Some of them more formal, some of them less formal, some of them reactions against certain ideas of the formal, perhaps. And so in a way, I'm also describing a practice which I find inconsistent, and I'm also very interested in that. I'm interested in sort of how to encourage an inconsistency within your own processes. I think it's truthful and sort of more related to the real life, perhaps, to suggest that, life can change, that you can continue to live rather than become trapped within your own sort of methods. I won't name any names, but I spent a little time in Vienna with quite an important conceptual artist, one of the first generation. And I found it very difficult, and it was a group of lectures, and I found it very difficult to become part of watching somebody justify something which had been a decision that had been made more or less, or constructed within the 1960s perhaps, 1970s, early on. It's a long time to justify an idea. And I think it's possible to find yourself in a position where you don't necessarily have to find yourself justifying anything in terms of the work that you make. You just act and you just live. You just actually make responses. And in a certain respect, you can suggest yourself as reporting in, that you don't do anything other than absorb and the stimulus that you're surrounded by, and then just report it in, just make it. But to whom are you making it for? And then that's a key question, that's kind of a key problem. I could expand that idea into the idea of the public realm, the public art. Maybe I will, maybe later. So, the naked male youth on the street bench, and the young nudes accompanying fire. Okay, so this is an early piece. This is another version of it. This was done on a jet engine, as you've noticed. Okay, so this piece in particular was interesting for me. I was making forms. I was making some forms which I'll probably show you next. I think that's next in line. I was trying to look for a new type of skin. I was trying to basically sculpt with membrane, a kind of a transparent plastic. And I wanted to suggest the idea that you could make a contemporary variant of skin, that you could, but not a metaphorical skin, not a physical one. I was just trying to find what that skin might look like. I'm still looking for it. And so when you're doing that, you're kind of thinking also, what would the real object be present within the same circumstances? So in a way, these pieces came at the same time when I was making plastic forms. I wanted to also introduce the idea that the reality, the real person, could also be present. And that real person could be then still insulting an object. And so the park bench version, the early version, came from the idea that troublesome youth on the estate that I live in was burning the street furniture quite consistently, and I wanted to kind of suggest that sense of empowerment could then transform itself into something else, and what that something else might be if you took his clothes away. It was kind of a perverse situation. And so, so it's not unusual for somebody to burn a piece of street furniture, but not to be nude. But it's a little less banal than that. I'm describing it a little bit too matter-of-factly, but I wanted to sort of make a composition about behavior to some degree, and about power. When you put an object in a room, that's also another thing that you have to consider when you're making objects, is that you are wielding a certain sense of power. You are sort of doing something to the room, or you're doing something to the people in that room. And it's quite interesting to try and take account, or to take stock of what that thing might be. I think people take that for granted, perhaps. You can put two objects together, you can put it in a room, but you don't take account of the fact that power might also be exuding from it. It's taken for granted, perhaps, that idea. And so, objects in the world aren't passive. You can take me to task on that statement, by the way. It's an earlier version. This is another version which was performed. It was performed by a number of different youths over the summer in different venues. This is a piece of street furniture made by Camden Council, my own Camden Council. And it's a social sculpture to some degree, without wanting to use a better phrase perhaps. But it's an object made by committee to secure a certain amount of security for the streets of London. This thing you can throw anything at this piece of objectness, and it will bat it back. And so in a way, this is the next piece that the boy will be present on. Camden gave me this. And it came from development in ballistics and all sorts of... And it's a contemporary object. It's an object which enthuses me greatly because it's an object made in the real world for the real world, but it created an object. And so for me, I wanted to use that. Rather like the jet engine is being insulted by the boy, perhaps, we can insult maybe some sense of authority in committees. Okay, it's entirely possible to blacken the street signs within the city, that the city's identity be slightly reduced. It's possible that individuals involved in the blackening of the signs be of a selective institutional social group. Simply, to blacken the street signs is to suggest that the city itself is becoming less visible. It's becoming less readable. That if you get rid of the street signs, then you become slightly lost. And it was a tactic. Some of these are tactics. Some regime, I think it was a Czechoslovakian regime, was daunted by the fact that the locals who knew the street signs blackened them out. It bought them some time. And I thought in a way that was a kind of a very specific and very active way of actually transforming your environment to such a degree. But to put this process, for instance, into New York or into London, what would you be trying to achieve? And I think that ambiguity is important. It's almost like an act, a willful act, without any sort of recollection of why that might be. That there's no sense of the meaning of why these objects are suddenly, or these statements are taken out of their context, the Velvet Revolution perhaps, and then suddenly recomposed into New York or the City of London. Why would you want to do that? And I think that the sense of meaning is also quite important. That it's a big wieldy subject, which I might get into in a second. But it's impossible. It's possible to defer the present. It's possible to defer the sense of the present, to refuse the present, so that objects don't simply exist in the present and tag themselves onto the present. You can actually deny that sense. And so, in a way, to rehistoricize these procedures is to do that, perhaps. A work is in tying the people to the stone monolith, bound, connected to the building, and in turn to each other as a single human chain to occupy the square. The public are to be tied to each other by their wrists in a limitless chain day and night. So in a way, this is another object. This is another structure made by people, and it's to an institution or to a building, but it's not a critique. It's just an anchor point. And so people can grow as an object within this piece of work. This is a photograph taken in Fleet Street of me pouring some petrol down the drain in Fleet Street and setting fire to it. And it was a piece of work which went on and on. It was basically, whenever I was a little bit dull on a Sunday afternoon, I would just get some petrol, pour it down a drain and set fire to it, see what that might look like. And then I made the piece of work a proposal. Basically, you can propose to do it. So I'll give you the proposal if you like. And you can just set fire to drains. But it was kind of an interesting kind of proposal because it was about how you're supposed to react or behave to your environment, perhaps, but in a completely sort of rather, not banal, but in a reactive way. This is where I used to live, Fleet Street, and this has been turned into an album cover for, I think, Wagner. Oh, got some colour. Living in the City of London was interesting because you felt under authoritative pressure all the time. And it was an interesting environment. You felt kind of under something and need to behave. Okay, a 5-ton sheet of steel named as Richard. Richard is prayed for by a South London prayer group. Richard is encouraged to fall from the roof or ceiling of a building to the ground. This fall is repeated during the day and night, Richard falls on a loose schedule. So basically, it's a piece of work which is basically an object which is in consistent falling, that its objectness is basically about falling all the time. That if you were in charge of this object, you would be in charge of an object which had to always continue to be falling in some way. I wanted to suggest that falling was the actual medium of the object. And so, yes, it would break your stairs, but it's quite a heavy object. And so Richard came from that. Richard is basically an object which falls. And so, yes, it was another way of applying a ritualistic behavior to the owner of the work, perhaps, but it was also to give purpose to this object, this rather banal piece of sheet steel, which then fall. I think Richard was quite a loaded name for it. An 80-kilo sphere of silver named Francesca. A South London prayer group prays for Francesca. Francesca is encouraged to fall from the window of an apartment into the ground below. Her fall is repeated over and over, and the fall is on a tight schedule. You would just basically push a ball of silver out of a window and basically keep on doing it. This is a very early brain work. So this is when I start messing around with strange objects and strange materials. But basically, this is made from bovine matter, brain matter. I was very interested in working with this matter because it offered a sense of reality. It offered the real structure of the world somehow. I wanted to work with something which cogently constructed itself as an object of the real world. It had a memory. It had structure, and that structure was divine to something, not divine, that's a horrible word, came from the sense that its environment created it. And so memory was part of it. And so this is a stainless steel grid, very heavy, very big, basically with chunks of prepared brain matter in each one. I showed this piece at the Turner Prize, and it didn't get talked about very much at all. And I don't find that surprising. But I think it was basically wanting to talk about a certain sense of brutalism also. I wanted to sort of imbue into the object a mechanical relationship. Stainless steel is an object, or as a material is an interesting material because it's a material that whenever there's humans about, there's stainless steel. It sustains us, it's cleanable. It basically is a material which allows us to have a cleansed and catered for life. You know, it's everywhere where we need to be, where we are present. You know, we need to be present within easy cleanable surfaces, perhaps. And so stainless steel is a very loaded material. So in a way, I don't let anything go. I don't use arbitrary materials. Stainless steel was a very specific choice, and the brain matter was specific. In the early days as well, is that the brain matter, I was present within the view of the calf before it had died. So I'm present within the brain matter too. I'm present within the structure of the brain matter. I found that a little macabre, so I stopped doing that. So this was a really early piece, which I made in France. This was made in Calder's studio. So basically, this is a stainless steel piece of sheet still, and it's got a laser cut motif, just a kind of a gestural motif of the landscape that I was surrounded by. So, little road, the Calder studio, you can see. It's abstract. And in the gaps, there's brain matter. And so in a way, I was so sort of, and I started working with the brain matter when I was at the Calder studio because I was under some kind of pressure. I was under some kind of, the environment was kind of converting me into something, and I just wanted to work on a liberation of materials again. And so I wanted to sort of maybe liberate the nature of these materials. And so yes, the brain matter was useful. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a dead end, I think. I made a group of works which was a willful dead end. They were wall-based pieces. I wanted to just basically talk about or work on a group of works which just didn't go anywhere. It was just basically the surface was brain matter smeared on a piece of perspex, about so big, 40 centimeters by 40 centimeters, off the wall 1 inch, 50 of them. And basically, I just wanted to coat those surfaces and then have a number of them. And then not really understand what it is, not really understand what it is for. And so it was a behavioral thing because my studio is in a very strange place. My studio is inside this housing estate, the old supermarket for a housing estate. And so I'm completely surrounded by people all around me, in front and back, in this brutalist building in London. And so in a way, I feel that my behavior is actually quite unusual within this environment. I shouldn't really be doing this, you know, blending a brain and then painting surfaces within basically an environment of people. I feel a little bit sort of unusual. And so, yeah, so I was doing this while I'm still surrounded by these people. Okay, so I'll flick through them, and basically they just suggest surfaces, about how you're supposed to deal with the surface, but in the most disinterested way. I was trying to basically choose a day to do it with the most disinterest that I could afford, just to do it, just to be somewhere else. These are coins with antidepressants in, but this is a different piece, and I don't know why this slide is here. Oh, this is, okay, so everything's out of sync, but okay, so this is a piece too, but okay. Back to these. I'll flick through them. You don't need to spend much time dwelling on them, because I think that there's a certain sense of value in dwelling on these sort of objects as well. It doesn't go unheard of that you make an object and there's a certain sense of evaluation that needs to happen straight after making that object. And that value happens on many different levels. And so in a way I was trying to sidestep that valuation. For instance, they're not for sale individually. They might not even be for sale. I give a lot of my work to the state. I give a lot of, God, that sounds really lefty, but basically I give objects like Seizure, for instance, to the Arts Council public art collection. A jet engine piece which I made for Art Institute in Chicago is now belongs to the Arts Council too. And it's basically an ownerless group of people. It goes to the country rather than a group of people who can use this for any kind of other use, if you know what I mean. The burial of an X-ray machine in Central Park. I think that speaks for itself. Okay, so these are the forms. These are the membrane forms of works which I made, which were... I'm going to rush a little bit because I want to get to Seizure, because I think that I always perversely put Seizure at the back of this lecture with the intention, perhaps, I wouldn't even get to it. But I will get to it. This is forms which are two males forms, usually male forms, having sexual intercourse or suggestive of sexual intercourse. And I wanted to make them out of a membrane material, which I was suggesting earlier. And so the membrane material itself was, as I said earlier, trying to sort of develop a technological skin. The idea that, you know, you could have a metaphorical skin for the future. And I was very interested in the sense of the membrane being the back of the cave, the origin of the membrane, perhaps, the back of the idea of origin of art itself, perhaps, is that the space that's beyond the cave. You know, you would draw on the wall of the cave, and that was your meeting with the nature of the wall. And then beyond that was the unattainable. And so in a way, there's a sense of the spiritual within that. And the early objects, the marking of pieces of red ochre with striations, was a ritualistic behavior, but was also the origins of how we're supposed to behave in object making itself. I do pertain the interest or the importance of making objects is very natural. I think production is problematic, but I think that object making is important. I think that basically that we need to continue to communicate through objects. We have to communicate through manifesting itself into the reality of the world. And I think that through that we can understand ourselves a little better, perhaps. So anyway, these are, after that ramble, these are constructed out of membrane of various sexual intercourse behaviors. Not great photographs, I'm afraid. Inserted into them is a little cake of brain matter into a little plastic bag. So it's got everything in these things. Right. And that's an original form in polystyrene. Skin of the artist Semen over the illuminating light bulbs of the city or institution. This is based on a piece of work which I made actually quite a number of years ago, which was basically to coat the lighting in the Cubic Gallery in London. Particularly interesting space. It's always problematic, the shows that they have there. And it was to coat the semen, my own semen, onto the lights, or just a couple of the strip lights. I didn't want to overdo it. Onto the lighting of the gallery, and that the gallery itself was then a continuous art form. The The light itself was imbued with property, and that property was then to be understood, perhaps. You know, to change the nature of the light. It acted as a filter. And so anything underneath that light then became, I don't know, sexualized perhaps, or corrupted perhaps. Who knows? It all depends what your kind of thoughts are about putting semen on light bulbs. But I think it's there. This is in Vienna. This is at the Freud Museum. So this is upstairs at the Freud Museum. This is the light bulb within the Freud Museum coated in semen. I thought it was the best place for it. And they did too, thankfully. And because they did ask me to do this. And so yes, I'm also trying to propose to do this to the Freud Museum in London too, but to the whole museum. It's quite a big museum, and I think it would be interesting to try and do it. And simply because I think that there's an abundance, there's too much. It's a strange behaviour, and I wanted to encourage this strange behaviour, this inappropriate nature. And I think also as well it's what you do when you're a teenager, perhaps, but it might not be something that you do when you're an adult. This is the Parthenon. This is also, the lighting is coated in semen for parts of the Parthenon. So this was a proposal which, for the first Biennale in Greece, in Athens, sorry, and so they went ahead and asked me to coat the lights. And so in a way the piece itself was, before the troubles began, before that poor kid got killed, it was basically just a place of disruption. It was, you know, there was this kind of rather fraught relationship that people had to the nature of the Parthenon, to Athens in general. There was a certain sense of stasis. This was from people I talked to, so you hit me if you want to, if you think I'm completely wrong on this one. But basically, it was the sense that I got was that there was an undercurrent, and so this was seen as a kind of an opening up. This was a possibility. You can't graffiti over this, but you can perhaps use your own materiality to maybe transform something in that self. And so through a different set of behaviors in the world, some satisfaction might come about your relationship to the static world that you're constantly facing, that you might be able to open up some territory by doing something. And so I was very interested in doing that. I spent a lot of time in cathedrals when I was a kid, basically. But I was very interested also in about how to open up the space or take up that space. It was boring. You know, I spent a lot of time basically in choirs, rather like those choir kids. And so it was interesting for me just to not participate in the religious side of things, but also to be an acknowledgement of the beauty of the environment that I was in. And so perhaps the semen piece kind of came from that, came from the fact that you wanted to just claim an environment which was all-encompassing, that had already been designated something else, a higher body. And you wanted to try and corrupt that, or not corrupt it, but just try and reclaim it because of the real world, the one that you exist in. This is a space which I claimed by pouring antidepressants into the environment. It's a very early forge. It's quite a historical forge. I was asked to basically do something to it. So I crushed up some antidepressant and spread it everywhere. And in a way, it was an old technology meeting a completely cutting-edge technology. I was very interested in antidepressants being a very key material in the world. It's a nice picture. Swap ecclesiastical furniture of one church with the ecclesiastical furniture of another church. It's possible to do. Okay, this is an object work. So this is the sort of the precursor objects to Seizure. This was the early work that I used to make when I was considering making the large crystallization project, which was Seizure, which was basically to take objects and to transform them, to render them into something else, to basically offer the possibility that you have a realm that you can cross. And through that realm basically is a rationalized one. It's just the aspect of crystallizing, which is a system of nature over an object. And so the cathedrals themselves were the first objects. This was a work for Chicago. And so it was basically, this is a long, long time ago. And so their models of cathedrals crystallized. This is a pair of engines crystallized. Still a formal language which I was establishing then, but still uncomfortable. And this is Seizure, this is the original building. So this is basically a piece of council housing which had its problems. It's a very unusual building in so much that it's basically all bed sits, all on the single floor, and the ones above were for carers of the people on the lower floors. So it had this very strange narrative to begin with. This is the building, derelict. We took over the building very quickly after it had become derelict. And in a way, we became the keepers of the building. We were practically given it by the council. Okay, rather pleasant courtyard. Okay, so this was after the crystallization happened. This is the actual interior of Seizure. That basically that some parts of the furniture, some parts of the structure of the inner nature of the building was actually still intact. So the bathroom was still intact. And so everything became crystallized. This was a light fixing. This was the gap between the bathroom and the I think the living room. This is the entrance from the flat next door. This is the crystallization close up. This is part of the floor. So, as I said earlier, this environment became, a place of destination to a certain group of people. But it also became kind of a popular destination for a lot of people anyway. But it was kind of interesting to see how people might react to this. It might be interesting. And I think going back to the idea of proposing, this was also a proposal. This began as a proposal. And I like to think that the proposal it came from, in a way, is an amplification of a thought. Thought itself being, if you reduce it, for me, this thought came at the time of a certain type of crisis for me, certain type of maybe mental crisis, and it was kind of interesting for me to actually propose an idea during this period of time, and that amplification basically meant that the piece of work was made. So it was an idea amplified. And so in a way, does that mean that my problem was also then amplified too? And so there was a certain sense of anxiety that was also brought into the work by me also having a kind of a problematic relationship with the idea itself. And so I was really, so for me, in a way, it became imbued with a certain amount of properties. When it was filled up with 75,000 litres when you fill a flat up or a bed sit up with 75,000 litres, it becomes a mass. It becomes this huge mass, this rather sort of hulking, rather quite depressing object. It's got huge amounts of mass, it's an incredible amount of dangerous chemicals. Apparently, it would have been the biggest chemical spill in London's history if it had fallen apart. And so that was kind of on our minds. And it did leak a bit. And it was, so in a way, it was building upon anxiety upon anxiety. It was basically the failure of a social institution, a social situation, rather like the idea of social housing, perhaps, a well-known failure within the country. But also, as well as that, to see what that to put across to the cutting edge of that problem, to grow onto the materiality of that failure, a system of nature, a system that is indifferent, that has a certain sense of its own nature, but it doesn't know about you. It's in the same way that Jupiter has no sense of us. This material has no sense of us. And so in a way, it was kind of important to confront people, perhaps, on a certain larger scale of a structure made for them that was a failure, but also then to be confronted by a system which was actually indifferent, completely indifferent. And so in a way, that was the anxiety of the work, something that I really wanted to kind of encourage. I wanted to keep the liquid in there for a long, long time. And I wanted to keep it in there. They wouldn't let me, obviously, but I think it was in that form, it was the perfect ambiguity. You didn't know if it was growing, if it was just an amount of dust on the floor. And I think it's no kind of surprise in a way that the engine piece, the dust piece, was made exactly at the same time as this piece. That the dust piece was manifesting a certain sense of the anxiety which I was kind of going under with this piece. I'm not completely insane. I'm not always filled with anxiety, even though that I keep on mentioning the word. But yes, it was kind of a high pressure at the time. And so, yeah, so the dust piece was kind of important. It was an important factor. It was a purging of this piece. Also, as well as it was a friendly, it's not friendly, this piece, but it was a piece that needed access. It needed to regard the public. And I felt, for me, that was a compromising position to be in. I don't really want to consider the public when I make artworks. I don't want other people to sit on my shoulders when I'm considering a piece of work. And so I had to negotiate with a public art group how to actually behave, how you're actually supposed to negotiate that. And so in a way, I tried to make Seizure as inhospitable as I possibly could, because I didn't want that loose subjectivity. I didn't want, and I got it. I certainly got it. I got lots of people telling me what it was. And I wasn't proposing what it was. And so in a way, that reflection is not something that I was welcoming in any sense. I think there's a certain sense of perfection in a work that reflects nothing back to you, just simply is. It's not a sense of meaningless for the sake of being meaningless. It can imbue the possibilities of meaninglessness attached to the ideas of mortality, perhaps, and death. That's a kind of a serious sense of meaninglessness, not total nihilism, but just, it's just something being. Whereas you can also have banal meaninglessness, something that's just meaningless, just for the whim of it. It's easy to do. And I think in a way I just wanted to just offer up a kind of a situation, a substance that people could enter into. And I think in a way a proposition and a substance is what Seizure was. And to see how people would then behave. And so its future then became uncertain. It was only supposed to be temporary. It was only supposed to last for a winter. All of this production to last for, I don't know, maybe 3 months. And then it got opened up again and again, and it suddenly got sort of people interested in seeing it again. And so this is the bathroom. This was its production. This was how it was made. We had to make a factory. And so we made a factory in the courtyard. This is a hole in a long barrow where people have stuck their finger into a piece of stone for years upon years, centuries. So it's made this strange kind of arse into the stone. And in a way, that's kind of what Seizure now wanted to become. It needed to become that. It needed to consider itself in the next place. This is Seizure being vacated from the building. It was slid out from the side. It turned out that you could take it out in one piece. And so the Arts Council of England wanted to entertain the idea. And so I gave it to them. And so now they want to consider its future. And that future might be on the land, it might be buried underground, it might be sort of, we're still negotiating what it is that future might be, what its next purpose is. But now Seizure is from an interior. This psychological interior is now perhaps an object itself. That it made the transference into an object. It's now this rather ugly, reinforced, kind of Judd-like thing. But it has purpose. It's another view. You can see on the left of the image is the truck it went on. Is it being pushed out? You had to push it out with jacks. Hydraulic jacks. This is like 40 tons. Pushed out sideways out of a building. This is an early piece. It's an engine with an umbilical cord. Well, it's not an umbilical cord. It's called the umbilical from an engine, going down to a crystallized cathedral. So it was pushed out the building. And in a way, I quite like talking about this breaking of the spell of Seizure to some degree. Okay, it probably doesn't translate, but basically, Seizure was something, and now it's something else. And in a way, I didn't want to become hierarchical or precious about what it was that Seizure was then to become next. I wanted to take away its identity again. I wanted to separate it from its origin, that it was being taken away from its context, the origin of its making. And so in order to do that, you are basically stopping it from having an origin. You're cutting it away. So it becomes a homeless object, an object of no of no particular place, perhaps. And so now I want Seizure to become an object of no particular place. Anyway, there's not many questions being asked from the audience, I've noticed. It's quite, yeah, it's not your fault. But I think that perhaps I'll probably leave it there. I've probably been speaking forever.
We have time for a question or two.
So are they dismantling this thing now? Is that what these last few...
Through its reinforcement, it meant that you could actually take it out the building. Because we needed so much reinforcement on it, it meant that it became a structure in itself. And so basically it was pushed out of the building as a reinforced object. That the flat itself was stripped back so that the walls were offered to the work, but you needed metal plate behind those walls. And so it just became an engineering situation, which was also something which I found enjoyable because in a way it was pragmatism. It was an object formed completely out of pragmatic decisions and questionably in artwork. So yes, it was, so it's been removed. And so this is the truck that they put it on. Oh yeah, no, we have to wait for the...
Hi.
Hi.
I'm embarrassed to say I did not see Peter Ely's September 11th show. So unfortunately, this question's rather ill-informed. But I was just wondering on what your feelings and perspectives was on being part of a show of that topic and how you felt your work placed in that, and especially since the plane, that object of anxiety for you that you'd been working on in many different ways for a long time that was now part of this other context and meaning.
Sure.
And just how that happened.
Okay, so it's a tricky one to answer. I think that it was important, actually. It's good for a piece of work to find its way into that kind of context. I think it's basically that I don't think it's possible to control the work. It's not important to control the work. You just have to introduce it and then see what happens. There's a lot of objects, a lot of works that I do make. None of them will be present in any lecture that I'll ever show. But they're still objects in the world. And some of them have a set of circumstances or suggest their possible future within them. And some don't. Some of them are more passive than others. And I thought that the dust piece itself was a formlessness which I enjoyed and I thought was important for me at that time. And I think it's an important thing for me to continue to try and investigate. So to find it in the 9/11 show was important. I think it was great to see it objectively. I've always seen that piece as basically made by someone else. Most pieces, I try to encourage that. And so, no, I probably saw it as much as you did, or anyone, sorry, you didn't see it, did you? But as anyone who did see it does. I think that there's a kind of a pureness in trying to detach yourself to such an extreme level from the objects that you make that it's possible to do without lobotomy. But I think it's necessary. And so in a way, no, I saw the work probably to try and justify it in the same way as anyone else did. I think I spoke about it a little bit in some text somewhere out there on the internet, but the question of... no, I won't go into that.
Hi. I have a bunch of questions, but they're quick.
Okay, cool.
The first one is, are the crystals still in the council building?
Oh, sorry, the crystal still?
In the council building?
No, the council building was destroyed. So the council building now is another 80 council houses built.
Did you have to do that? Did you have to dismantle the whole thing?
Yeah, because it's it didn't belong to us. It was a space that we took over, but we couldn't have because it belongs to the council, and so it was the last ditch of the building. Is the last thing that it needed to go through before it was demolished was us kind of violate it in this way, and so yes,
okay,
it's all gone.
So, sorry, I'm a fine arts student, so I have all these little questions.
Sure.
The jet engine remains. You keep them in what look like garbage containers.
They're for transportation.
Are you worried that they're ever going to be mistaken for garbage? Because art is transported in such precious ways.
It's a possibility. But it happens, people throw things away. But no, I don't think it's, it could happen. I could never say never. But no, they're not garbage cans. They're transportation cans.
Bins.
Yeah.
Mm. Okay, my last question is, are you preparing anything special for the Turner Prize?
Oh, no, I've done the Turner Prize. It was.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
In relation to that, say, piece, which is at PS1, I'm wondering whether, since you don't actually see the engine be atomized or pulverized, rather, at all, and I think you said you sent it to South Africa to be done, and then, of course, the viewer doesn't see that happen, whether doubt and trust play any role for you in that piece?
Yes, I think it probably comes up in a lot of people's work. I think it's certainly... It's tricky. It's basically how you're perceived to behave. And so I guess there is a certain sense of trust that this object is what it is. I think also as well as that, and I guess in a way actually during that process there's a certain amount of trust from me too, from the people who produce the work. Yes, of course, it all goes down the line. There's also no separation between intent and the object. The intent was to almost have an illustration in your mind about what this object was going to then look like. It looked exactly like it did in my imagination of the object. Absolutely no imagination went into that piece simply because it's a pile of dust almost. So I had to imagine a pile of dust be present in the world, and that basically that pile of dust is now operating as a pile of dust that was an engine. And so for me, no, it's probably not that important actually. I think it's intentional. It's about what your intentions are. And so, again, it's a proposal. So yes, no, I know what you're saying. It's kind of interesting to bring the word trust up. And I come from England, which is a wonderful exporter of half-truths. And I think that, perhaps... Yeah, so perhaps it's kind of an interesting... It's an interesting question. Sorry, I'm being a bit vague. I've got jet lag, like how?
Since we're allowed multiple questions, are you interested in creating anxiety in the viewer, and if so, to what end?
No, I'm just... it's always going to be there. The anxiety in the viewer is always present. You've got it. You can't bring up a phantom of anxiety. It's present within everyone. And quite rightfully so. Because we're surrounded by anxiety creating objects, and we create to our worst nature rather than to our best. I think mobile phones are probably a good example of that. But I think it's sort of... so in a way, to recognize the idea that we create to our own worst nature is part of the project somehow, is to actually fully understand how it is that we're supposed to behave with our future objects. We can't keep on creating this crap. And so it's kind of interesting to propose or to suggest another proposal. But I'm not an optimist. I am an optimist, but I'm not a utopian. And so I think it's, we'll see how it plays out.
I have a question over here.
Sure.
Sorry, I didn't have the mic. This is kind of just a resources question, but I'm really curious how you first got the Boeing engines. If you convinced them to donate them, or I imagine they must be really expensive.
No, they're not expensive at all. You can buy one really easily. It's I I'm going to quote somebody completely out of context, but I think it was Hannah Arendt who suggested the idea that power was lying in the street for anybody to come and pick up, that it was possible for you to come along and use apparatus that had been maybe deemed for higher things, for warfare or for potential kind of aggression, perhaps made by lots of people over lots and lots of time, and then suddenly discarded. This power is then discarded, and it's important and interesting to take stock of that, to understand what is out there, which is an object of certain dominance, and then suddenly you can pick these things up. They're not used anymore. They become obsolete, but they're still powerful. And so, so for me, I got on the internet, and you can find most things, and it's kind of banal. It's wonderful. You can just surf until you get it, and in a way, that's another symptom of a rather laissez-faire society. In a way that we just can do this. We can graze till we become. We can graze ourselves into a situation which then is something useful. But we can probably apply a certain sense of the imagination into that process and to see if you can break through into something else. And so, the engines came from these really strange pair of guys that sell these things in England. They live in a big country house, and they're surrounded by Chinooks and Harrier jump jets. And, it's a very unusual thing. I won't say too much about them.
Thank you.
I have a question over here. Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I was particularly taken by the piece that you showed of the model of the cathedral and linked by an umbilical cord to the engine. And I was wondering if I could ask you to maybe just expand a little bit on the figure of architecture in your work, of the architectural monument, and the way you link it to almost this technological monument, the figure of the motor. And, because of course these are kind of opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of stability, mobility, and your work, you described it as very concerned with the idea of transformation, of things changing into other things. And so I was wondering, if you could just tell us a little bit more about those two recurring objects within your work, the figure of architecture and the figure of the motor, and how, what are they helping you do?
That's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure. I think that it's the architect thing is quite important, because that piece is one of the very rare pieces before I stopped titling works. Now everything's untitled. But that was called The Architect's Mother, so in a way it did have its link to that. I was trying to describe the idea that an architect did have a mother, and that she broke her back kind of bringing up a kid, while the architect was working out the backbone of buildings somehow. I wanted to kind of relate kind of the sentiment of the spinal column directly into the building. It's quite, the verticality of New York is a wonderful kind of place to be, because, you're surrounded by these backbones. And so, in a way, I wanted to just be more lyrical with that kind of work. Back in those days when I made that kind of work, there was a certain sense of the poetic, or the desire for poetics, to be a kind of a stimulus. To offer objects into other objects, to offer them up to each other, and to see what kind of possibilities, playfulness might actually occur. And so, so it was important to put the motor in the same arena as the cathedral, and to see what kind of language might sort of emerge. I think it's about formation. It's about language formation, perhaps, but nothing specific. And I suppose, in a way, I did suggest that I was going to talk about meaning, but I can tell that we're probably getting on for time. But meaning is an important factor in the work. It's about the denial of it to some degree. But to what language do you use in terms of that denial? I think psychoanalysis pops up into the work, but I don't use that language. I think it's a language trap. And it's established language and a field that you can look through art with, but it's not necessarily the right one. It's probably actually quite a bad one. And, sorry, I'm coming a bit hard on that one. But, so in a way, all artworks in the future will have a new language, will have some kind of language which is established, which is more contemporary to the period that it lives in. Artworks are supposed to last forever. And so that means there's countless other possible languages that it could come into contact with. I don't think there were certain artworks that happened a couple of hundred years ago that knew that psychoanalysis was going to come along and suddenly reveal things. And so, yeah, so it's in the anticipation of a language which might actually be useful and possible is what I like to consider some of the works to be made from. I think it's possible to suggest that language will catch up or become certainly more sophisticated when we know what our brains are actually doing, perhaps. And so we can push our Greek gods to the side when we become more aware that the sea does have tides, or volcanoes do what they do because of nature, not because of some benevolent god that you need to keep happy. And so in the same respect, our language will become more acute, but also probably more rationalized. And hence, a new development of language might then sort of decide that these objects have some kind of value over others. And I think we're in that period at the moment. We're in that kind of unnameable, unformed period where we're stuck between ideologies. We're post-ideology to some degree, but with the desire that we could move into something else. And so when you're in that period, certain motifs tend to rise to the top. And so in a way we have to fight them. I won't become too definite about that. But so when we fight them, we might get to a better and clearer kind of sense of language that we can use. I'm losing my voice, so I should probably shut up now. But
well, that's probably great. Thank you, Roger. Really wonderful to have an opportunity for the first time in New York to hear you talk about your work, so rich, so layered, complex, provocative, poetic, and a wonderful collision of all of those things. So, Roger, thank you so much and for getting through jet lag. We hope you'll be back in New York again soon. And that we'll get to see more of your work here. So really, once again, thank you all for joining us tonight. And Roger, thanks for a terrific talk.
Thanks for having me.